The first and only time I pulled a trigger, I shot the man who ruled our town like a king. But that wasn't the day my life changed. That came earlier, the moment I gave water to a dying Apache. 3 days later, his entire tribe was slaughtered in an ambush set by my neighbors. Men I'd known for years, men who smiled at me in church, then burned children alive by moonlight, and all because I showed mercy. This is the story of what kindness cost me, and why I'd do it again. It started with a cup of water. Sounds harmless, right? Like something you do without thinking. But out here in the Arizona territory, kindness can cost you your land, or your life. My name's Hannah Moore. At least, that's what it says on the deed they tried to steal, and the grave they nearly dug for me. And what I'm about to tell you, it isn't a story about heroes or victims. I mean the kind of silence that wraps around your ribs like a noose, cold, unyielding, and suffocating. The silence that presses down so heavily you can barely draw a full breath. It's the silence of a widow left alone, too stubborn and proud to sell the land she inherited, too isolated to feel truly safe. A silence born from being surrounded by people who would rather see your home burn to ashes than allow you to keep it. They whisper behind closed doors and cast sideways glances, their judgments sharp enough to cut. And in that silence, your heart pounds loud, a lonely drum in the empty rooms of your life. The heat. That's the first thing that sticks with me when I think back to that day. Not the gentle warmth of a summer breeze. No, this was something different, harsher, the kind of heat that feels like it's swallowing the world whole. It made the air taste bitter, like ash mixed with cold metal, choking and dry. The kind of heat that sits heavy on your chest like a dying animal, its breath shallow and labored, daring you to keep putting one foot in front of the other. The sun shimmered off the cracked earth, bending the horizon in a mirage that made every fence post look like it was swaying, dancing just out of reach, teasing me with a hope that wasn't there. James had been gone nearly a year by then. The fever came like a thief in the night, quick and merciless. It felt like God blinked and forgot to stop it. One moment he was stacking firewood by the barn, the next he was sweating through his sheets, delirious and whispering about wolves prowling in the walls. No preacher's prayers could save him, and no doctor dared ride out this far into the empty, dusty stretches where sickness whispered its cruelest songs. And just like that, my world shrank down to a ranch and a lifetime of memories. And so the ranch was mine. Mine to fix, to guard with tired hands, to watch slowly rot while the world outside whispered and sneered. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones behind the church doors and over stacks of flour at the general store. She should sell, they said. She's too proud. She ought to remarry, find someone who'll actually put that land to use. As if I were nothing more than a slab of spoiled meat, waiting for the butcher's cleaver. Their words stung like barbed wire, but I held on, because this land was all I had left. That morning, I was wrestling with the same damn fence post James had promised me he'd fix before he died. It stood crooked and stubborn, leaning drunkenly like it was mocking me every time I swung the hammer, refusing to stand straight no matter how hard I tried. My hands were blistered raw, cracked from the dry air and endless toil. Sweat soaked my shirt and clung to my back like wet burlap, dragging my spirit down with its weight. My mouth felt like sandpaper, dry and cracked, tasting of dust and regret. Why am I doing this? I thought, pounding the nail into the dry earth as if it owed me something. What the hell am I even fighting for anymore? The thought haunted me, echoing louder with each strike. The ranch, the memory, the stubborn grip on a future that felt more like a ghost. And then, I saw it. No. Him. At first, it was just a vague shape near the ridge behind the barn. Maybe a bundle of tattered rags, or a bloated coyote carcass baking in the merciless sun. But something twisted deep inside my gut. A warning, a shiver down my spine. I squinted against the heat shimmer, and that's when I caught it. A flicker of movement, subtle but undeniable. My body acted before my mind could catch up. I grabbed James's old hunting knife, the same one I'd used for everything from cutting twine to peeling apples, and edged closer, my boots silent on the cracked, powdery dirt. With every cautious step, my heart thundered louder, hammering against my ribs like a wild drum. My throat tightened so much I thought I might choke, and then finally, I saw his face. A man. An Apache. Lying on his side, half buried in dust. Blood had soaked through his deerskin shirt, staining the cracked earth beneath him like rust. One shoulder was mangled, the skin torn open so deep I could see the glint of bone. His black hair was long, tangled with burrs and dry leaves, his chest rising in shallow, painful jerks. I froze completely, as if the air itself had thickened around me, trapping me in a moment suspended between life and death. Every story I'd ever heard about this land, stories told in whispers and shouts, in warnings passed from mother to daughter, father to son, surged through my mind like a wildfire racing across dry, brittle grass. The raids on helpless homesteads, the charred remains of burned farms that still haunted the edges of my dreams, the screams of children taken in the dead of night, never to be seen again. The women, torn from their homes, their families, their lives, left only with memories and scars. It was all there, rushing back with brutal clarity. Enemy, savage. Those words exploded inside my head like the blaring sirens of a town about to be destroyed. They echoed louder than my own ragged breathing. The warnings were instinctual, primal. Run, get the rifle, barricade the door, protect yourself, survive. I stepped back once, then twice, each retreat heavier than the last. My lungs rebelled against the dry, scorching air. They refused to fill properly, constricting as if the weight of centuries of fear and hatred was pressing down on my chest. My heart hammered painfully, every beat a frantic plea to move, to do something. But my feet felt rooted, my body locked in place, and then he groaned. A low, guttural sound that didn't belong to a warrior on the battlefield or a killer stalking prey. No, it was something far more fragile and human. It was the desperate sound of someone clinging to the fragile thread of life, someone teetering on the razor's edge of death, scratching at whatever scraps of existence remained just out of reach. He tried to lift his head, to look up at the world that was slipping away from him, but his strength failed him. His arm twitched once in a weak, feeble motion, then dropped limply by his side like a broken branch. And I just stood there, frozen in a state of shock and disbelief. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. Hours that might as well have been an eternity. The world around me faded into a blur of heat and silence, while I remained rooted in place, caught in the raw and unbearable reality of that moment. Then, deep inside, something inside me cracked. It wasn't pity, not the soft, sentimental kind. This was sharper, darker, angrier. A hard, burning refusal to be helpless any longer. A scream that had no sound but tore through the quiet like a lightning strike. I thought of James, my James, dying in that fevered haze, slipping away while I did nothing. I had watched him fade, powerless to save him. I had been frozen then, too. I promised myself silently but fiercely, I won't do nothing again. With that fierce resolve burning in my chest, I spun on my heel and ran, desperate for a lifeline. Back to the cabin, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my ribs. I reached the barrel by the kitchen door, the old battered barrel that had maybe 2 inches of water left, murky but precious. My hand trembled as I grabbed the dented tin cup James used to drink from, the one scarred with a dent where he'd thrown it against the stove during one of our few angry fights. I carried that cup back to the wounded man like it was a vessel of gold, every step weighted with urgency and hope. When I reached him, he hadn't moved. Not a twitch, not a sigh. I dropped to my knees beside him, stones and jagged roots digging harshly into my skin, and hovered over his broken form. The smell hit me. Blood, sweat, and something wild and ancient. Something that didn't belong to towns or churches or the rules of men. It was raw and untamed, the scent of a world untouched by civilization. "Here," I whispered, my voice cracked and raw from the heat and fear. He didn't respond. I hesitated, doubt gnawing at me. Was I mad? Had the relentless sun cooked my mind? Was this just a hallucination brought on by loneliness and exhaustion? Gently, God help me, gently, I slid my arm beneath his head, careful not to jostle him. His skin was burning hot, a fever that told me the infection was spreading. Death was closer than I wanted to admit. Then his eyes snapped open, dark, black as midnight glass, reflecting a wild and feral spirit that seemed barely contained. For a brief moment, they burned with raw, untamed fire, sharp, piercing, full of pain and desperation. He looked at me, and in that gaze, I saw confusion, fear, and a flicker of something like trust. He looked as if he didn't know whether to lunge at me in defense or collapse in surrender. "I'm not here to hurt you," I whispered, though the words felt fragile, as if I was trying to convince myself as much as him. Slowly, with trembling hands, I raised the tin cup to his parched lips. He flinched at first, startled by the sudden motion, but then, to my relief, he stared directly into my eyes, still unmoving, still fragile. "Do it," I urged silently. "Drink, damn you. Live or die, but don't waste this." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he parted his lips, slowly, carefully, as if the simple act of drinking was a monumental effort, and then he drank. One sip, then another. Each swallow was a struggle, every drop a small victory. But when he finished, he let out a sound unlike a groan, unlike pain. It was something softer, something I hadn't expected, relief. Maybe. His eyes slowly closed, and for a moment the fierce weight of the world lifted just slightly. I lowered his head and set the cup down. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly spilled what was left. My heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted out. "What have you done?" The words echoed inside my head like a thunderclap, loud and unforgiving. I didn't know whether they were my own thoughts or some invisible voice condemning me. I stood up fast, my legs stiff and shaky beneath me, my heart pounding as if it wanted to tear itself free from my chest. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a hidden gopher hole in the dry dirt. The world felt off balance, spinning, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. "You just gave water to a dying Apache." The weight of those words crushed me. This wasn't just any man. This was the kind of man they preached against every Sunday from the pulpit, the kind the townsfolk whispered about with venom and fear. The kind they painted as the enemy, as a savage who threatened their fragile lives and peace. The same kind who had burned down the Wilson Ranch 2 summers ago, leaving nothing but ashes and screams in their wake. The kind I'd been warned about since I was a child, told he'd slit your throat for blinking the wrong way or breathing near his fire. They were the stories that haunted every step I took out here in the Arizona territory. And yet here I was, kneeling beside him. And I gave him life. The rest of the day faded into a haze, like a dream slipping through my fingers. I remember staring out the grimy window, watching the sun climb higher while the tin cup sat forgotten on the kitchen counter, drying slowly in the relentless heat. I washed the blood off my hands twice, but the scent clung stubbornly to my skin, iron and earth and something wild and untamed. I kept James's hunting knife on the nightstand, its blade dull but familiar, a silent reminder of the life that had slipped through my grasp. The rifle was there too, leaning against the wall. It wasn't loaded. I didn't even know how to load it properly, but just having it close made me feel less vulnerable. less naked in a world that seemed determined to strip me bare. When night finally fell and darkness wrapped itself around the ranch, I didn't light a lantern. Instead, I sat in the shadows, letting the blackness swallow me whole. I listened, really listened, to the sounds of the night. The eerie howls of the coyotes echoing across the hills, the creak and groan of the rafters above, shifting and settling like an old beast breathing in its sleep, my own breath, steady but shaky, filling the silence between those sounds. The night was alive, humming with unseen life and endless possibilities. And then the ground moved, not with the violent shake of an earthquake, not with a sudden jolt that threw everything off balance. No, it thumped. A deep, steady thump that vibrated through the floorboards beneath me, into my bones. A rhythm. Hoofbeats. Not 2, not 4. Dozens. No, 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 no. They were coming, not for him. For me. I crawled to the window, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The horizon was still dark, but I could see it. A flicker of orange. Dust rising. The glow of torches. Silhouettes on horseback. Shadows moving like phantoms across the land. I clutched the useless rifle tightly, as if sheer willpower could somehow make it sprout bullets out of thin air. My fingers trembled around the worn wood and cold metal, trying to find some grip on a weapon that wasn't loaded, that wouldn't save me. But it was all I had, a fragile lifeline in a world closing in fast. I held it like a talisman, a desperate hope that somehow it might protect me, even though I knew it was nothing but a bluff. This is it, I thought, heart hammering hard enough to drown out everything else. This is how it ends. Not in the quiet of my sleep, not in the gentle fading away of old age. No, it would be right here, on this cracked, sun-bleached porch, with my lips parched and cracked from dry winds, a broken fence barely holding back the wilderness, and a tin cup of water that had saved the wrong man. A cup of water that might just have doomed me. And still, somehow, I didn't regret it. Not yet. Because buried deep inside me, in that secret place where pain and hope tangled and fought, a part of me was ready. Ready for whatever was coming next, even if it meant the end. The sound came first as a low, distant rumble, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew, swelling, rolling, growing louder and louder until it became a thunder that shook the very floorboards beneath my feet. The sound vibrated through the walls of my little cabin, filling every crack and corner, awakening something ancient and terrifying in the desert. I remember pressing my face to the cool glass of the window, my breath fogging up the pain in misty clouds as my heart pounded like a war drum in my chest. Outside, silhouettes moved against the blood-orange dawn, shadowy shapes riding fast across the horizon. Riders, so many riders, a wave of dark figures moving steadily, silently, inexorably. They weren't whooping or yelling like in the stories I'd heard as a girl. No, these riders moved with a terrifying, disciplined silence, a calculated calm that was more frightening than any wild yell or war cry. They fanned out across the land, spreading slowly and surely, surrounding my small ranch like a creeping shadow, closing in from every side. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the old rifle, its weight heavy and cold in my grasp. It felt useless, a sham, a desperate bluff that no one would believe. And deep down, I knew they'd see right through it. They'd call it. Then, through the haze of dawn and dust, I saw him. The man from the ridge. He was among the riders, slumped low on a weary pony but upright, holding on with every ounce of strength he had left. Someone had tied a crude, makeshift bandage around his wounded shoulder, the fabric stained dark with dried blood. He looked different. Still weak and pale beneath layers of grime and sweat, but there was a fierce, burning light in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a fire that refused to be extinguished. One warrior, taller and broader than the rest, dismounted with a deliberate calm. He was imposing, his face set in hard, unyielding lines like carved stone, his gaze locked directly on my cabin. Then, with a slow, commanding gesture, he signaled to the others. The wounded man was helped down gently from his pony, supported by his brothers in arms. My porch, my home, felt 1,000,000 miles away as my legs finally obeyed. One step, then another, I forced myself forward, each movement heavy with uncertainty and fear. A chill ran down my arms, raising goosebumps even though the desert sun was already climbing and promising heat. The rifle felt like a dead weight in my hands, useless and cold, a fragile last line against a storm I couldn't hope to hold back. The wounded warrior took a step towards me, then another. His movements were slow and careful, favoring the injured side of his body, but there was something strange, an undeniable dignity in the way he carried himself despite his pain. His every motion spoke of resilience, of a strength deeper than flesh and bone. The other warriors remained silent, standing like statues around us, their eyes glinting like chips of obsidian, hard, dark, unreadable. The air grew thick with tension, so heavy it was almost suffocating. I could barely draw a full breath. What were they going to do? What had I done to bring this upon myself? He stopped a few feet away. His gaze met mine. No accusation. No gratitude, not yet. Just an assessment. He was younger than I'd first thought, maybe early 30s, his face lean and weathered, a thin scar tracing his jawline. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture I didn't understand. Then he finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, roughened by the harsh dryness of thirst and the deep ache of pain that pulsed through his battered body. Yet despite its weakness, the sound carried clearly through the still morning air, filled with a quiet, desperate strength. It was a voice that had endured suffering, but refused to be silenced. "Dakota," he said, his hand rising slowly to touch his own chest, as if to confirm the name, to anchor himself in this world. That was his name, Dakota. A simple word, but one heavy with meaning, history, and weight. It echoed between us, breaking the silence like a fragile bridge. Then he turned his gaze toward me. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes, a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and perhaps a fragile hope. His lips parted, and he said simply, "Water." The words were halting, broken, but the meaning was clear. He was acknowledging what I had done, the gift of water, a rare and precious thing in this unforgiving land. He then turned to the lead warrior, a tall man whose gaze was sharp and cold enough to cut through stone itself. The warrior's face was carved with the hard lines of command and experience. Dakota spoke to him in Apache, a short guttural sentence full of meaning that I couldn't understand with my outsider's ears. But even though the words were foreign, I understood the subtle shift in the air. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed. It softened, becoming less hostile, less filled with immediate threat. Instead, it became watchful, wary, as if they were reconsidering me, weighing the strange woman who had dared to save one of their own. The lead warrior gave a curt, sharp nod. Around us, several others murmured softly in agreement. The murmurs were faint but carried an undercurrent of acceptance. And just like that, as silently as they had appeared, most of them began to melt back into the surrounding landscape, disappearing like ghosts into the heat and dust of the desert, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. All except Dakota. And one other. This other warrior lingered behind. He was younger, with eyes that burned with a fierce, suspicious fire, eyes that didn't trust easily, eyes that weighed every move with cold calculation. Later, I would learn his name was Koyo. He stared at me with an intensity that felt like ice sinking into my skin, then shifted his gaze to Dakota. His hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt, a silent, constant threat. His distrust was a tangible thing, like a cold wave that rolled across my porch and left me shivering in its wake. Dakota ignored him completely. Without hesitation, he walked past me and made his way toward the barn. There, in the shade cast by the weathered water trough, he sank down heavily against a wooden post as if this simple act of rest was something he'd done 1,000 times before. He closed his eyes, his face drawn tight with exhaustion, pain etched into every line as if the very life was being squeezed from him. I stood there, frozen, the rifle suddenly feeling absurdly foolish in my hands. A useless weight. My mind raced. The town. If anyone from Dry Hollow had seen this moment, seen me kneeling beside this Apache warrior, what would they say? What would they do? The thought made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the desert wind. It was a warning, more to myself than to him. "They'll come. The sheriff, the townsfolk. They won't understand." I could almost hear their judgment, their fear, their anger. Dakota opened his eyes again, that fierce, intense gaze locking onto mine. But he said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. "I gave you water," I said, my voice gaining strength, determined now. "That's all. I can't shelter you." But even as I spoke, I knew the lie hidden in those words. I wouldn't turn him away. Not now. Not like this. He needed shelter, and I was the only one who could offer it. His voice came then, rough and broken, heavily accented but resolute. "You saved. I protect." I blinked, startled by the simplicity and weight of his promise. Protect me? From what? From them? I gestured vaguely toward the places where his warriors had disappeared into the desert, the unspoken dangers that lurked in the shadows, dangers born of fear, hatred, and a world that was never kind to those like us. He shook his head slightly. "From all." A pause. "Until wound heals or danger sleeps." It was so matter-of-fact. So final. Koyo finally spoke then, a harsh string of Apache directed at Dakota. Dakota's response was short, quiet, but firm. Koyo's eyes narrowed further at me, a look of pure venom, before he finally spun on his heel and mounted his pony, riding off with a last, lingering glare that promised trouble. The air around us seemed to crackle with tension, thick and electric like the calm before a storm. Koyo hadn't ridden far. He had pulled his horse up just beyond the worn fence line that marked the edge of my property, settling into a loose, watchful stance. His gaze was fixed on us, sharp, piercing, unblinking, watching, waiting. And deep inside me, a cold certainty began to coil and tighten like a snake in my chest. He wasn't just observing. No, it was more than that. He was judging, weighing every movement, every word, every breath between Dakota and me. And whatever verdict he was reaching, it was clear he didn't like what he saw. Dakota, slow and deliberate, pushed himself to his feet, a wince of pain crossing his face as his injured shoulder protested the motion. His body leaned slightly to one side, bearing the weight unevenly, but his stance was firm and unyielding. He faced Koyo directly, eyes locked with that younger warrior's fierce glare. What followed was another rapid exchange of words, this time in Apache, but it was different. The rhythm was faster, more urgent, crackling with anger and frustration. Koyo's gestures were sharp and sweeping, his hand first pointing directly at me, then arcing broadly to encompass my entire ranch, my sparse belongings, the fragile life I'd built here. His voice rose, sharp and accusing, like a blade cutting through the dry desert air. Though the words themselves were foreign to me, the meaning was unmistakable. "She's white. She's the enemy. What are you doing?" Dakota stood his ground firmly, unflinching despite the pain that made him sway slightly. His voice, though quiet, carried a core of unbreakable steel, a strength born of deep conviction and fierce loyalty. He spoke, his words measured and resolute, and instantly Koyo fell silent, though the fire in his eyes did not dim. His glare burned hotter than ever, filled with disbelief and rage, but he said no more. I caught sight of Takota's good hand, the one untouched by injury, clenching tightly into a fist at his side. It was a small gesture, but filled with immense significance. I realized, with a sudden jolt, that he was making a choice. Right here. Right now. Between the ingrained hatred and fear his people carried for outsiders like me, and something else, something stronger, something born from that simple act of giving him water when no one else would. He was choosing to stand with me. My breath hitched. This was it. This was where he turned, where the fragile thread of whatever had passed between us snapped. Koyo spat sharply onto the parched ground, the sound harsh and contemptuous in the stillness around us. The look of pure disgust twisted his rugged features, his jaw clenched tight, nostrils flared with anger and disbelief. It was clear from the way his eyes burned that he thought Takota was a fool, blinded by some foolish notion of honor or misplaced loyalty. Or worse, something far more damning, a traitor to his own people, a brother who had turned his back on their shared blood and history. Without warning, Koyo muttered something else under his breath, low and threatening, a string of words heavy with menace and warning. Though I couldn't understand the language, the tone carried a weight that felt like a promise of violence. Then, with a sudden, sharp motion, he wheeled his horse around, kicking up a cloud of dust and dry dirt as he spurred the animal into a gallop. His figure soon blurred and faded into the shimmering heat haze of the desert, swallowed by the unforgiving landscape. But even as his form disappeared, the threat he left behind lingered, thick and suffocating. It hung in the very air around us, like a dark storm cloud ready to burst, filling the silence with an ominous tension that made my skin prickle. Koyo's distrust of me was fierce and unyielding, a cold, bitter force that would not let him rest. And I knew deep in my bones that he would stop at nothing to make sure Takota paid a heavy price for the choice he had made, for daring to protect me, a stranger, a white woman, in defiance of everything their people had been taught to fear and hate. Takota turned slowly back to me, his face unreadable and shadowed by exhaustion. The brief confrontation had drained what little strength remained in his wounded body, and I could see the toll it took in the slump of his shoulders, the heaviness in his eyes. Despite the pain and anger, there was still something steady and resolute in his gaze. Koyo, thinks I betray you," Takota said haltingly, his English fractured but clear enough to understand. "Thinks you trick." His words carried a raw honesty, a weight of regret mixed with defiance. "And you?" I whispered, my throat dry and voice barely audible. "What do you think?" He held my gaze for a long, searching moment, those dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart beat faster. Then, with a quiet finality, he spoke. "You gave water," he said simply, as if those words alone explained everything. As if that single act, the kindness of offering water to a stranger on the brink of death, outweighed generations of bloodshed, hatred, and deep-rooted mistrust between our peoples. "Life debt. I stay." His words settled over me like a solemn promise, a pact forged in the harsh desert sun. Despite all the pain and the danger, Takota had chosen to stand by me, bound by a debt far stronger than fear, the debt of life itself. My legs felt weak. I leaned against the porch railing. A life debt, to me, a woman who couldn't even fix her own fence properly. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of insects and the distant caw of a crow. He was staying. And with Koyo's distrust burning in my mind, I knew this was far from over. It was just the beginning of a very dangerous path. The next few days passed in a haze of relentless, stifling heat and thick, unspoken tension that settled over the ranch like a suffocating blanket. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the earth to dust and making every movement feel like wading through invisible fire. Dakota stayed close by, mostly keeping to the barn where shadows offered some relief from the burning light. He was a silent sentinel, a watchful presence who rarely spoke, but whose eyes seemed to take in everything. Every whisper of the wind, every distant sound, every flicker of danger. He never asked for food or water, never made a request for anything. But I learned quickly that he accepted what I left out for him. Each evening, I'd place a modest plate of stew and some crusty bread on an old wooden crate near the barn door, and every morning when I returned, the plate was always clean, the food gone. It was a small, quiet connection between us, a bridge built from simple, shared survival. Dakota moved with a quiet efficiency born of hard experience. His wound was healing slowly and painfully, but it was healing. I noticed he tended to it himself, carefully rewrapping the bloodied bandages with strips of cloth I'd left out for him. He refused my help with a stoic shake of his head, as if my concern was a foreign language he couldn't speak. Wound must stay. Pain teaches, he said once, his voice low and steady, words that carried the weight of old wisdom and fierce endurance. I tried to bury myself in the mundane chores, mending clothes with trembling fingers, tending to the few scrawny chickens I had left, but my senses were always on edge. Every snap of a twig, every shifting shadow sent a jolt through me. Koyo's hostile face was burned into my memory, a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the safety of my fences. The thought of going into town filled me with dread, but I was running dangerously low on flour and salt, essentials I couldn't do without. When I finally made the trip to Dry Hollow for supplies, the stares that greeted me cut sharper than any blade. They were like tiny knives slicing through my skin with every look. Whispers trailed behind me as I walked down the dusty main street, words that hung heavy in the air. That Moore widow, heard she's keeping company out at her place. Company? More like harboring a savage. The voice of Old Man Hemlock, who ran the general store, was barely a murmur as he rang up my meager purchases, avoiding my eyes as if my very presence was a blight. The ride back felt longer than usual, the oppressive silence of the endless plains pressing in around me like a weight. My mind churned with fear and frustration, every mile closer to home filling me with unease. As I neared my property, I saw him. Not Dakota, another man. He was slumped near the cottonwoods by the mostly dry creek, not far from my land, but close enough to set my nerves on edge. Too close. The tattered remnants of a U.S. Cavalry uniform clung to him, stained dark with what looked horrifyingly like fresh blood. A chill ran through me. Oh, not again. My first instinct was to ride past, to pretend I hadn't seen him. I'd had enough of wounded men and the trouble they brought with them. But that stubborn spark inside me, the part that had given Dakota water when no one else would, flared up fiercely once more. Damn it all. I dismounted, tying my horse's reins to a low-hanging branch. My boots crunched softly against the dry earth as I approached cautiously, every nerve screaming. "Hello?" I called out, voice tentative but firm. He groaned in response, a guttural sound of pain and exhaustion. The man tried to push himself up, struggling against the weight of his injuries. He was young, barely more than a boy, really, with wide, terrified eyes that darted around frantically. A deep gash on his forehead oozed blood slowly down the side of his face. "Water," he croaked hoarsely. "Please, water." My canteen was half full, cool against my palm. I hesitated only for a heartbeat before uncorking it and offering the precious liquid to him. He drank greedily, spilling some down his chin in his desperation. "Thank you, ma'am," he gasped, wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. "Thank you. Name's Roy Keene." "What happened to you?" I asked, keeping my distance but unable to hide the concern in my voice. "Ambush," he said, eyes wide and jittery, darting nervously to the horizon. "Apaches. They killed everyone else. I played dead, Managed to crawl away. Apaches. The word hit me like an icy dagger. Dakota. Just then, a shadow fell over us. Dakota. He moved with such silent grace I hadn't even heard him approach. He stood there, expression unreadable, his face a mask of calm watchfulness, as his eyes flicked from me to the wounded soldier, then back again. There was no judgment in those dark eyes, only a fierce, quiet vigilance. Roy Keene stiffened immediately, terror flooding his features as he caught sight of Dakota. "Apache!" he shrieked, scrambling backwards in panic, his hand reaching desperately for a pistol that wasn't there. He's with me," I said quickly, the words strange and unfamiliar on my tongue. "He won't hurt you." Dakota's gaze, however, wasn't on me anymore. It was fixed on Roy Keene, fixed with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His whole body had gone rigid. His hand, the one that wasn't injured, clenched into a fist. I'd never seen such a look on his face. It was more than anger. It was recognition, and a pain so profound it was like looking into an open wound. "Dakota?" I whispered. He didn't look at me. He took a slow, deliberate step towards the terrified soldier. "You," Dakota said, his voice a low, dangerous growl I'd never heard before. It vibrated with a grief and rage that was terrifying to behold. Roy Keene whimpered, pressing himself against the dirt. I don't know you." Dakota's good hand slowly rose, pointing a finger at Keene. "You wear the blue. You rode with the butcher." The butcher? My mind raced. I'd heard tales, whispers among the settlers of a particularly brutal cavalry captain, known for his scorched earth tactics against the Apache. "My mother," Dakota said, his voice thick with unshed tears and a simmering hatred. "The raid on White River, years ago, she wore a red shawl." His breath hitched. "You were there. I saw your face. You killed her." The world seemed to stop. The air crackled with an unbearable tension. Roy Keene's face had gone chalk white. He was shaking his head, muttering, No, it wasn't me. So many raids, I don't remember." But his eyes betrayed him. There was a flicker of horrified recognition there. My heart slammed against my ribs. The man I had just given water to. The man Dakota blamed for his mother's murder. Here, on my land. Dakota took another step. His hand drifted towards the knife at his belt. I could see the battle raging within him. The years of pain, the burning need for vengeance, warring with what? The debt he felt he owed me? This was a test far greater than Koyo's distrust. This was a blood feud, raw and bleeding, laid bare right in front of me. And I, somehow, was in the middle of it. What was I supposed to do? Protect the soldier who represented everything that had destroyed Dakota's world? Or stand by and watch Dakota exact a revenge that, by his people's laws, was probably justified? My mind reeled. This was a moral quagmire I had no map for. The silence was deafening, broken only by Keene's ragged breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Dakota's eyes, filled with an ocean of grief, locked onto Keene. The air thrummed. This was the precipice. The moment stretched, taut and terrible. Dakota's hand hovered over his knife. Roy Keene was a cornered animal, eyes wide with a primal fear. I could almost feel the heat of Dakota's rage, the crushing weight of his loss. "Dakota," I said, my voice low but firm, trying to cut through the storm in his eyes. "Don't." He didn't look at me. His gaze was welded to Keene. "He killed her. My mother. She sang to the corn. Her hands. Gentle." His voice broke, raw, with a pain that was years old, but fresh as a new wound. "And killing him now," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Will it bring her back? Will it quiet the songs she can no longer sing? Silence. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, a mournful sound. Slowly, so slowly, Dakota's hand moved away from his knife. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a fraction, but the inferno in his eyes still burned. He looked at Keen with a loathing so profound it was like a physical blow. "Go," Dakota bit out, his voice like gravel. "Before I remember what mercy I have forgotten." Roy Keen didn't need telling twice. He scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over himself, and fled, disappearing into the brush like a frightened rabbit. He didn't look back. Dakota stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where Keen had been. Then he turned and walked away, back towards the barn, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the world seemingly upon them. He didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. The encounter left a dark stain on the uneasy peace we'd found. That night, the air felt heavier, charged. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of Dakota's grief-stricken face seared into my mind. The past wasn't just a shadow here, it was a living, breathing monster. Sleep refused to come. My mind was a whirlwind of restless thoughts, but beneath it all, a cold, sharp premonition prickled at the edges of my awareness. A silent warning crawling beneath my skin like icy fingers. The night stretched on endlessly, thick with a heavy stillness that pressed down on my chest, making each breath feel shallow and urgent. Hours crawled by until finally, around midnight, that ominous feeling shattered the quiet. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from outside, shattering the fragile peace like a stone thrown into glass. The chickens, startled and terrified, shrieked in a cacophony of fear, their frantic clucking ringing out into the darkness. And then came the harsh voices, rough, slurred, thick with drink and rage, snarling and shouting with dangerous intent. "Come on out, Moore! We know you're in there with that redskin lover!" The words sliced through the night, crude and venomous, dripping with hate and accusation. My blood turned to ice in my veins, freezing every thought except one: protect. I grabbed the old rifle, still unloaded, still useless as anything but a heavy club, and crept toward the window with trembling hands. Outside, flickering torches carved angry shadows against the night. At least 4, maybe 5 men stood there, their faces hidden behind crude masks, obscured by darkness and fear. Townsmen emboldened by alcohol and the cloak of night. One of them kicked open the door to my already battered chicken coop with a brutal crash. Feathers exploded into the air like white sparks caught in a storm, swirling and falling as the terrified birds scattered. Another hurled his torch inside. Flames licked eagerly at the dry wood, hungry and fast, consuming everything in their path with a crackling roar. "No!" I screamed, fury flooding my voice far more than fear, and threw open the door to my cabin, stepping into the night with raw determination. Before I could even place a foot on the porch, Dakota was there, a sudden blur of movement, swift and silent as a shadow. He moved with a lethal grace I had only ever glimpsed before, like a predator striking with deadly precision. He made no sound, but his presence hit me like a thunderclap, powerful and overwhelming. One of the masked men, wielding a heavy stick, swung wildly at Dakota. Without hesitation, Dakota ducked low, his counterattack a swift, brutal strike to the man's ribs. The man wheezed, the breath knocked out of him, and crumpled to the ground. Another lunged at Dakota, brandishing a knife gleaming in the torchlight. I screamed his name, panic choking my throat. Then, from the shadows at the edge of my property, another figure emerged. Koyo. My heart leapt in a wild, confused hope. Was he here to help? Was he coming to stand by us in the fight? No. Koyo let out a piercing, savage war cry, but it wasn't aimed at the drunken townsman. Instead, with terrifying speed and ferocity, he launched himself at Dakota from the side, tackling him hard. The 2 warriors crashed to the ground in a tangled heap of limbs, struggling and fighting in the dirt. Betrayal, sharp and sickening, coiled in my gut like a venomous snake. Koyo hadn't just distrusted me. He had actively sought to undermine Dakota, to punish him for the choice he made to protect me. I wondered in horror if he had colluded with these men or simply seized an opportunistic moment to strike. The remaining townsmen, momentarily stunned by the sudden chaos, recovered quickly. They saw their chance. 2 of them advanced on the struggling warriors, clubs raised high, ready to finish the fight. "Get the other one of them shouted, pointing directly at me. Panic gripped me with icy fingers, cold and absolute. My hands fumbled wildly with the rifle, my mind a blank canvas of terror and desperation. I was caught, helpless, unarmed, and trapped in a nightmare from which I could see no escape. Then, without warning, the night erupted into chaos. The stillness shattered by a barrage of sounds, sharp, sudden gunshots ringing out in rapid succession. But the shots weren't fired by the drunken townsmen who had attacked my ranch moments before. No, these came from further out in the darkness, distant but growing closer with every beat of my pounding heart. Along with the gunfire came screams, not cries of anger or rage, but agonized wails of pain and desperation that sliced through the night air like knives. Apache war cries, fierce, raw, and haunting, filled the desert sky, different from Koyo's piercing yell, their voices weaving together in a chilling symphony of defiance and sorrow. The townsmen who had been so bold moments earlier suddenly froze, their drunken bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. "What in the—" one of them stammered, confusion and fear twisting his voice as he glanced nervously around. Their confidence faltered as the reality of what was unfolding dawned on them. The arrival of reinforcements, warriors unlike any they'd faced before. Meanwhile, Koyo and Dakota were still locked in a desperate, brutal struggle on the dusty ground beneath the flickering torchlight. Dakota's healing shoulder hampered his movements, each motion sending a sharp pang through his body, while Koyo's treachery added a dangerous unpredictability to the fight. The odds were clearly against Dakota. Suddenly, with a fluid motion born of practiced skill, Koyo rolled free from Dakota's grasp. A gleaming knife flashed in his hand, catching the torchlight with a deadly sparkle. But instead of lunging at the townsman, Koyo turned his blade toward Dakota, aiming to strike his supposed brother down. Before the blade could find its mark, a gunshot ripped through the air, deafeningly close. Koyo cried out in shock and pain, clutching his wounded arm as the knife skittered across the dirt. Lost. The shot had been true. Dakota, breathing heavily, looked up through the haze of smoke and shadows. Standing there, illuminated by the flickering flames and torchlight, was one of his warriors, a figure I hadn't seen since that first day when Dakota first arrived at my ranch. His face was grim and set with fierce determination, his eyes burning with unyielding fire. More warriors emerged silently from the darkness, moving with deadly precision and speed. They swept in quickly and efficiently, dispatching the remaining townsmen who had dared to attack. The fight was swift, brutal, and merciless. In moments, it was over. The night air thickened with the choking smell of gunpowder, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke rising from burning wood. The chicken coop was engulfed in flames now, casting an eerie, dancing light that flickered across the scene like ghostly specters. Dakota rose slowly to his feet, every movement labored and painful. He fixed his gaze on Koyo, who was clutching his bleeding arm, his face a twisted mask of fury, frustration, and pain. The warrior who had fired the shot spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice sharp and accusatory. Other warriors gathered around, their faces grim and heavy with the weight of betrayal. It was unmistakably clear that Koyo's treachery had been exposed to them all, but the sounds of fighting coming from further out had not ceased. In fact, they seemed to grow more distant, but no less horrifying, punctuated by chilling screams and cries that pierced the night's veil. Dakota's head snapped up sharply, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He exchanged a string of urgent, desperate words with the warrior who had come to his aid. Then, without a single word directed at me, Dakota turned and sprinted into the darkness, heading straight toward the distant sounds of battle. His warriors followed him swiftly and silently. I was left standing alone, trembling uncontrollably, the useless rifle still clutched in my hands. Koyo sat motionless, bound and silent, a prisoner of the few warriors who remained behind. The acrid smell of smoke, blood, and death hung heavy in the air, suffocating and raw. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the aftermath. The fire in the chicken coop burned itself out, leaving behind only smoldering ruins. Koyo was taken away, his fate unknown, his silence a grim echo. Just before dawn, Dakota returned, alone. His body was caked with dust and blood, though I prayed fervently it wasn't his own. His face, oh, his face. It was a living canvas of unimaginable grief, raw and etched with sorrow. He walked like an old man, his steps slow and heavy, his shoulders bowed beneath a weight I could scarcely comprehend. He came to the porch, where I sat, numb and shivering despite the lingering heat from the dying fire. He sank down onto the steps, burying his head in his hands, the depth of his despair radiating from his every movement. They are gone, he whispered, voice hoarse and broken, each word heavy with loss. All of them. What? I breathed, my heart constricting painfully. What do you mean, gone? The townsfolk, he said, voice thick with a rage so quiet it was terrifying in its intensity. Not just these few drunks. It was a trap. They knew Koyo. Koyo told them some of our warriors would be watching your ranch, distracted. His voice cracked with the weight of the betrayal. While he dealt with me, the others, they ambushed our camp. Women, children, elders. His body began to shake uncontrollably as great, silent sobs racked him. Betrayal, from my own, and from your people. My people. The words struck me like a searing brand. The crushing weight of what the townsfolk, my people, had done, facilitated by Koyo's bitter jealousy and deceit, slammed into me with brutal force. An entire tribe, decimated, destroyed. Because of a feud over me. Because of fear. Because of hatred? Dakota lifted his head, eyes blazing with a grief so profound it felt like staring into the endless abyss. Only me, he choked out. I am the only one left. The world tilted. The last of his tribe. Gone. The silence that followed his words was heavier than any stone, filled with the ghosts of unspoken names, unfinished lives. I could only stare at him, this man who had lost everything, kneeling on my porch, the scent of smoke and death clinging to him like a shroud. My hand reached out, hovering, before I let it fall back into my lap. What comfort could I offer in the face of such desolation? Words were ash. The days that followed were shrouded in a suffocating blanket of grief. Dakota moved like a ghost, his silence a living entity in the small spaces of my ranch. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He would stand for hours, staring out at the mesas, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes held the inferno of his loss. The betrayal by Koyo, the massacre of his people by the townsfolk. It was a wound far deeper than any physical injury. I did what little I could. I left food, though it often went untouched. I kept my distance, sensing his need for solitude, yet trying to convey with my presence that he wasn't entirely alone. The townsfolk of Dry Hollow. I couldn't even look in that direction without a wave of nausea and shame. They had committed an atrocity, hidden behind a veil of self-righteous fear. One chilly evening, exactly a week after the devastating massacre that had left the Apache camp in ruins, Sheriff Maddox rode out to my ranch. The man looked older than I had ever seen him, his face lined deeper, his shoulders stooped under the weight of some invisible burden. The fire in his eyes was dimmer, replaced by a weariness that spoke of too many long days and sleepless nights. He dismounted heavily from his horse, boots hitting the dry earth with a tired thud. His eyes avoided mine, darting down and away as if the words he carried were too heavy to face directly. "Hannah," he said, voice rough and subdued. "There's talk in town about what happened at the Apache camp." I met his words with a flat, tired voice. "Talk?" I said. "Or bragging?" Maddox winced at my bitterness, rubbing the back of his neck. "Some folks are calling it a victory," he admitted quietly, "but others are keeping quiet." His gaze finally met mine, grim and conflicted. "Brody's been stirring things up. He's claiming he ran off the warriors that attacked you, that he's some kind of hero for the town." Brody. The name twisted in my mouth like bitter poison. The man who had tried to burn down my chicken coop. The man who coveted my land and spread lies like wildfire. Of course, he'd twist this horrific event to serve his own greedy ends. "He's lying," I said firmly, the fire igniting inside me. "It was Dakota's warriors who saved me from Brody's thugs that night, and Brody's men. They weren't the ones at the main camp." "I know that, Hannah," Maddox said softly, "and you know that, but Brody's got people listening to him. He's saying the land's cursed now, with all that Apache blood spilled nearby, saying it's not safe for a woman to be alone, especially one who consorted." He trailed off, unwilling or unable to finish the accusation. "Consorted?" I repeated, cold anger rising like a storm in my chest. "I gave a dying man water, Sheriff, and then I tried to stop another from being murdered. Is that consorting?" Maddox sighed deeply, his hand running over his worn, tired face. "Brody's filing a claim," he said, voice heavy. "He says he has a prior agreement with James for this land. He's got a document. He's taking it to Judge Leland tomorrow morning. Says he's going to have you evicted. For the good of the town, he says." The letter. James's letter. It had to be the same one. Brody must have kept his copy all these years. My heart sank with the weight of inevitability. After Maddox left, a grim resolve settled over me like a steel cloak. I found Dakota by the smoldering remains of the chicken coop, sifting carefully through the ashes as if searching for some lost piece of hope buried beneath the ruins. "Brody," I said quietly. "He's trying to take the ranch. He says James promised it to him." Dakota looked up slowly, eyes hollow but for a flicker of something fierce and dangerous. "Brody," he spat the name with contempt. "He leads the jackals. He's going to the judge tomorrow," I told him, urgency in my voice. "I have to stop him." Dakota rose slowly, every movement weighed down by pain and exhaustion. "We stop him," he said simply, his voice low and steady. The next morning, we rode into Dry Hollow together. The town felt different, the usual bustling energy replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Eyes followed us wherever we went, hostile, fearful, some even guilty. The weight of suspicion hung heavy in the air. At the courthouse, Brody was already there, surrounded by a half-dozen cronies, strutting like a rooster claiming his territory. Judge Leland arrived moments later, a stern, humorless man with a cold gaze that seemed to weigh the very souls of those before him. "Judge!" Brody called out loudly, stepping forward with a grandiose flourish. "Glad you're here. I've got the paperwork proving my rightful claim to the Moore property. For the safety and decency of this town, that woman needs to be removed." He gestured toward me with theatrical contempt. I stepped forward, fists clenched tightly at my sides, voice firm despite the storm brewing in my chest. "That's a lie, Judge. He's been trying to scare me off my land for months." "The only one doing any scaring," Brody sneered, "is that savage you're keeping." He pointed directly at Dakota, who stood silently beside me, imposing, calm, a living testament to the truth. Judge Leland raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "Enough. Mr. Brody, you claim to have a document from Mr. Moore?" Right here, Judge, Brody said smugly, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. Just as he did, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter I had found. James's letter. My copy. I have a letter too, Judge, I said, my voice trembling slightly but filled with resolve. From my husband. It shows his intent to discuss a sale, but no sale was ever finalized. No deed was ever transferred before he died. The judge took both documents carefully, his eyes scanning each line. A murmur spread through the crowd, and Brody's face flushed red with anger and frustration. This letter you have, Mrs. Moore, the judge said slowly, it does suggest a discussion. Mr. Brody's document appears to be a promissory note, contingent on a finalized agreement that I see no record of ever being filed with this court. Brody's eyes bulged. What? That's preposterous. We had a deal. A deal you tried to seal with threats and violence, I shot back, my voice rising with a fierce conviction that pushed aside the fear gripping my heart. The words burst out of me like a storm breaking free, each syllable sharp and unwavering. You sent men to my ranch. You tried to burn me out. You sent fire and fear to my home. The crowd shifted uneasily as I spoke, their murmurs growing louder beneath the weight of my accusation. Brody's face twisted in a mask of fury, veins bulging on his neck as his anger boiled over. Lies, he bellowed, his voice raw and explosive. She's a crazy woman, consorting with Indians. She's the real threat here. He pointed an accusing finger at Dakota, who stood silent and imposing beside me, a living symbol of everything Brody wanted to destroy. It was clear he was losing. The confidence that had once filled his swagger faltered, cracking under the weight of doubt and dawning realization in the crowd's eyes. Whispers spread like wildfire, confusion mixing with disbelief as Brody's carefully constructed image of power and control began to crumble before their very eyes. Then, in a sudden, terrifying moment, Brody snapped. His hand darted inside his coat faster than anyone could react. For a brief second, time seemed to stretch, slowing to a crawl as I caught the cold glint of metal, the unmistakable shine of a pistol. Brody, no! The judge yelled, voice sharp and urgent, breaking the stunned silence. But it was too late. Brody's eyes were wild and unhinged, locked on Dakota with deadly intent as he drew the pistol from beneath his coat, the weapon clearing the fabric with a sinister smoothness. Everything that followed happened in a blur, faster than my mind could process. Dakota moved first, a blur of motion, pushing me back gently but firmly behind him, his body coiling like a spring ready to snap, tensing to intercept the deadly shot aimed at us both. But this time, I moved too. I don't know where the sudden strength came from. Instinct? Adrenaline? A desperate clarity that sliced through the chaos? The rifle I'd carried from the ranch, the old rusty thing I'd never loaded, never fired, was still slung over my shoulder. Somehow, my hands found it, grasping the worn stock with fierce determination. As Brody's gun cleared his coat and Dakota lunged forward, my fingers fumbled clumsily, unpracticed and shaky, but they found the trigger. There was no thought. No hesitation, only a cold, clear certainty that this was the moment to end it. Not again. No more. The rifle bucked violently in my hands, the explosion ripping through the air with deafening force. Brody screamed, a high, thin, agonized sound that echoed like a wounded animal. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck, his pistol falling with a clatter onto the dusty street. Smoke curled into the air, thick and acrid. Then, silence. A stunned, absolute silence that swallowed the courthouse square whole. I stood there, trembling uncontrollably, the rifle still pointed in my shaking hands. My ears were ringing, buzzing with the intensity of the blast. The sharp, bitter smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, invading every breath. I had done it. I, Hannah Moore, the quiet widow, the woman everyone had counted out, had shot a man. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My knees threatened to buckle. Dakota was beside me instantly, his hand steadying my arm. He looked from Brody, writhing on the ground, to me. His eyes, there was shock, yes, but also something else. A dawning respect, a new understanding. The crowd was frozen, staring. Judge Leland, pale but composed, finally broke the spell. "Sheriff, see to Mr. Brody. And someone fetch Doc Adams." Men rushed forward, chaos erupted, but through it all, I could only feel the weight of the rifle in my hands, the echo of the shot, and the profound, terrifying realization that I had crossed a line. I wasn't the same woman I was that morning. I wasn't sure I even knew who I was anymore. The shot that changed everything. It wasn't just Brody's future that had been altered in that split second. It was mine. Irrevocably. The aftermath was a blur. Brody was carted off, howling more from wounded pride than fatal injury, though my shot had been true enough to shatter his collarbone. The sheriff, after taking my statement and that of a dozen stunned onlookers, simply told me to go home. There'd be an inquiry, he said, but given Brody drew first, and in front of the judge no less, he didn't think I had much to worry about from the law. The town, however, that was a different story. The whispers didn't stop, but their nature changed. Fear, yes, but also a grudging, bewildered respect. The woman who'd shot Silas Brody. The woman who stood with the Apache. I was an anomaly they couldn't categorize. Back at the ranch, the silence felt different, heavier, yet somehow clearer. I scrubbed the gunpowder residue from my hands until they were raw, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of the rifle bucking, the image of Brody falling. Dakota watched me, his usual stoicism touched with something I couldn't quite name. Concern? Maybe. "You saved my life," he said later, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon. It wasn't a question. "You saved mine first," I replied, my voice still hoarse. "Many times." A new understanding passed between us, forged in shared trauma and the undeniable truth of what had just happened. I had taken a life, or near enough, to protect him, to protect myself. The line between us, the one drawn by race and custom and fear, had blurred almost to nothing. A few days later, the rains came. Not a gentle shower, but a deluge, the kind of sky-splitting, ground-soaking storm that washes the world clean. It drummed on the roof of the cabin, turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. And in the heart of that storm, Dakota began to build a fire, not in the hearth. But outside, in the downpour, near the place where his warriors had fallen, where the earth still felt scarred, he worked with a grim, focused intensity, sheltering the nascent flames with his own body until they caught, spitting and hissing against the rain, but holding, a stubborn, defiant light in the gray gloom. He didn't ask for my help. But I brought him dry kindling, shielded the fire with an old piece of tin when the wind howled. We worked in silence, a strange, shared ritual. When the fire was blazing, casting flickering shadows against the relentless rain, he began to chant. Low, mournful sounds that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. It wasn't a language I understood with my mind, but my heart understood. It was a song of grief, of remembrance, of farewell. He stood before the fire, rain plastering his black hair to his skull, his face uplifted, and he spoke names into the storm, names of his people, his mother, his warriors, his lost tribe. He was performing a funeral, Apache style, under the cleansing rain, with only me as a witness. It was the most powerful spiritual thing I had ever seen. The flames leaped, the rain fell, and his voice, raw with sorrow, wove a tapestry of loss and love. I didn't intrude. I just stood by the porch, my own tears mixing with the rain on my face, bearing witness to his profound grief. When he was done, hours later, the fire was dying, and the rain had softened to a drizzle. He was soaked, exhausted, But his eyes, the inferno of rage was gone. In its place was a deep, quiet sorrow, but also a flicker of peace. He had honored his dead. He came to me then, on the porch. He reached into the deerskin pouch he always wore and pulled out something small. He pressed it into my hand. It was a necklace. Simple. Beautiful. Carved beads of bone and turquoise, a single polished river stone, and a dark feather, perhaps from a hawk. For you, he said, his voice raspy. For the water. For the fire. For life. My fingers closed around it. It was cool against my skin. Dakota. The stone, he said, touching it gently, is from the White River, where my mother, where she rests. The feather is for courage, the beads, for the path we walk. I couldn't speak. I simply unclasped the cheap locket I always wore, James's picture inside, a relic of a life that felt a lifetime ago, and fastened Dakota's necklace around my neck. It felt right, heavy, significant. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. We didn't speak of love, not in words. We didn't need to. What had grown between us was wilder, deeper than that. A bond forged in dust and blood, in shared loss, and a fierce, unspoken loyalty. In the weeks that followed, a quiet rhythm established itself. The ranch began to heal, and so, slowly, did we. Judge Leland officially dismissed Brody's claim, citing his attack. Brody, humbled and in pain, left Dry Hollow soon after. The town kept its distance, but the hostility had faded, replaced by a wary acceptance. They knew I wasn't to be trifled with, and they knew Dakota was my shadow, my protector. We never talked about leaving. This land, once a symbol of my isolation, now felt like ours, a sanctuary. One cool autumn evening, as the stars blazed with an almost painful intensity in the clear desert sky, we sat by a small fire outside the cabin. I leaned my head against his shoulder. He didn't stiffen. His arm came around me naturally, holding me close. Sometimes, I said, looking up at the vast, indifferent sky, the smallest act, giving water, it can ripple across generations, can it? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the flames. Then he looked down at me, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion that still took my breath away. "It can save a soul," he whispered. "Or two." And in that quiet moment, with the fire crackling and the desert wind whispering secrets around us, I knew he was right. We were two broken souls, scarred by different worlds, who had found an unlikely solace, an unexpected rebirth in the heart of the storm. My story, it isn't a tidy one. It's filled with regret, with violence, with choices I still question in the dead of night. But it's mine. And it started with a cup of water, an act of simple humanity in a world that had forgotten what that meant. And that, I've come to realize, can change everything. Absolutely everything.